Great to see all of you this morning. If you haven't already met them, the Andersons are here. Kevin used to be on staff here as well. Welcome home. We're glad to have you and give our best to Kevin as well. He's part of this story, part of our church, and your family is as well. And we're so glad and blessed that you're here this morning. We're going to finish up our series, FOMO, the fear of missing out, and we've gone through a number of fears of loss and fears of things that we anticipate happening. Today we're talking about a fairly tough subject. It's the fear of losing everything, which is a worst-case scenario for all of us, meaning the very things that we think are precious, that are sacred, that are holy, that make life worthwhile. What does it mean to lose them, and how do we respond to them as well? So we're going to look at this book, maybe one of the best stories written in the Bible, and stories are everything. I'm convinced that when we leave this world, all we have is a story, the story of our life. Our story to God is our gift to God in exchange for the gift of life. And those stories matter. So let's bow our heads. God, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. At some point in your life, you begin to look back over your ancestry and you realize the importance of the people who have gone before you, the people who helped pave the way, who endured all kinds of hardships, overcame challenges. And you look back and you have a greater appreciation the older you get of just what they did for you and how they shaped and maybe provided some opportunities. You have your stories. I hope at some point in your life you begin to look at those that have gone before you. In my story, I have a grandmother. She stood a towering 5'2". She was the toughest woman I think I've ever met in my life. She was born in the Oklahoma Territory. I didn't say Oklahoma. She was born in the Oklahoma Territory, meaning she was born before Oklahoma even became a state in the territory of Oklahoma. She survived Depression, the Dust Bowl, and during the World War, she went to Washington to serve her nation, to find some place to help the war effort. They were farmers. They were literally in tough times, difficult circumstances. From one year to the next, she didn't know if you even could make a living, and she overcame all of that. She went through the life, and I look at the things that she experienced and realize she really encountered the worst that life had to offer, but it didn't change her, or maybe it did, because she always saw the best in everything in every wonderful place she could. That was just sort of her mentality. My name for her was Sarge because she was the toughest person. She told and was giving orders one day, and I was a little kid, and I said, "Grandma, were you in the military? Because you act like you're a sergeant," and that's the name that sort of took off. My brother, who was my middle brother, went through a period, and I'll just leave it at this, that he was a little wild. My parents decided the best remedy was send him for a summer to go spend the summer with Sarge. I don't know what happened, but he came back changed, and when Sarge died, nobody cried more than my middle brother because she changed his life. Somewhere in the story, in your story, are the people who have gone before you that helped pave the way, the challenges they faced. You just sort of think about it, the hardships they endured, lessons they learned, the faith they sustained, the memories that they made, and you begin to realize in our collective history that we've got these things that really do form us and impact us more than we're probably aware. In our whole family of faith, we have a lineage behind us that have gone before us. We trace it back to the stories of the Old Testament and the New Testament. We trace it all the way back to Naomi and Ruth. Because Ruth, the book, the story, reminds us of what we already know, that life is often a series of gradual losses. And you'll begin to experience this. It's just inevitable. There's inevitable loss in life. We leave home at an early age, we miss opportunities. Some things really don't work out like we thought or hoped. There are disappointments. We're going to stumble, we're going to fail. Members of our family, loved ones will pass away, we'll lose close friends. At some point, these gradual losses begin to mount up. We'll lose our job, we'll lose our identity in some ways, we'll lose our hope. And now you begin to read this story in a different context because it's a famine that triggers everything. The devastating news, there is no food, you have to seek it elsewhere. And it sets into motion a chain of events that really ripples throughout the Old and New Testament, and I suggest even to us today. Naomi is forced to leave her home, her friends, her community, everything that she knows, because the famine requires it. And what happens? A series of losses, devastating losses. She loses her husband. Her 2 sons marry Moabite women, but they also die. So now there's just the 3 of them. And that's the deepest fear that we have, is literally to lose everything. Losing the people in our lives, losing things we hold most precious. And so if it weren't enough just to grieve the loss of a husband, she's now grieving the loss of her sons as well. When the famine finally lifts, Naomi decides to go back. But she is so bitter by the experience, she changes her name to Mara, which means bitter. So the name reflects exactly how she feels. Life has been difficult, unfair, unjust. She didn't deserve this. She's experienced more than her share of pain and suffering. And now the story boils down to the fact you have only 3 women who are vulnerable, feeling unprotected, trying to decide where to go from there. They decide to go back home where Naomi at least has a place. But as they begun to go forward, Naomi realizes that's not their home. Their home is in Moab. And so she encourages them to stay. Orpah is the one who says and understands that she really ought not to follow her. As much as they want to be with Naomi to help her into the next phase of her life, Orpah is the one that knows practicalities. There is no life for her there. So she turns and goes back, which is what Naomi wants. And she wants Ruth to do the same, but then Ruth does not and will not leave her. And in fact, it's the one moment that you read this, you know these words. Instead, it's one of the greatest lines of the Bible. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die and be buried. May Yahweh do anything at all to me, and even more as well, if even death parts me from you. There's a sense that she says, wherever you're going to go, I'm going to go. I cast my lot with you. I'm going to be with you. I will not leave you alone. It doesn't matter where you go. It doesn't matter. I've never been there before. I don't know anyone there. It's not my people, not my culture. It doesn't matter. I love you. I will not leave you. Will not abandon you as well. It's really an echo of a Hebrew word, Hesed, which is this unrelenting love of God. It's the whole notion that I hope you and I have understood, that God makes a promise to say, there is no place you can go where my love cannot find you. There's no depth so deep. There is no mountain so high. There is no pain so great, no night so dark that I cannot find you and bring you back to life and back to where you need to be. And it's this echo that what Ruth is doing to Naomi is what God does for us. And where she learned it, where she understood it, it's incredibly a part of her life and faith as well. And the story doesn't end there, of course. And that's why I love this story. Because if you go back, they're not isolated incidents of the people in your life. It's a trigger of a ripple effect that begins to affect other generations. So this story doesn't end with them going back. No, it's a combination of an incredible story from the depths of losing everything to fulfilling a promise that God has made. So it doesn't end there. All you got to do is turn to Matthew, look at the genealogy of Jesus and the listing of all those names where most people read names that they don't even recognize and their eyes glaze over. And what I want you to do every once in a while is pay attention, because there are a number of women listed, 4 of them. One of them is Ruth, which means Matthew is saying, without Ruth, there is no Jesus. Without a famine, there is no Ruth. Without Jesus, there is no gospel. So what does Ruth and Naomi have to teach us? What do you glean from this story? Why don't somebody take the time not only to retell it and to memorize it, but to write it down for future generations? And anticipating that on some similar scale, all of us are going to face a time when we feel like we've just lost everything. And is there any word of hope that we can give to future generations? Somebody took the time to set this down to make sure that we read it. What are the lessons that we're supposed to learn? One of them is to hang on to hope. And I know that sounds trite, but if you lose hope, you lose everything. Hope means the end is not the end, that God's word is the last word, that whatever I'm facing is not the last thing. There's something beyond what I see. Even at the moment of death, the promise is it's not the end, that there is something beyond what we just see. And our hope is in Jesus Christ, and our hope is not in vain. The moment you and I lose hope, there is nothing else. It just feels like a finality. It feels like a death. Second thing is the realization that we need other people and other people need us. We're on a journey together. And I know there are people who really pride themselves on being independent, never needing anybody. It's almost this point of hubris. I don't need anybody and I don't care about anybody. And at some point in your life, you realize you can't get through this life by yourself, or if you do, you're not going to be as effective or as in the depths of your faith. It means we just need other people. And I think God has this uncanny ability to bring alongside of us people that we need, that we didn't even know we needed. That God has our paths crossed with people. And I'm always convinced of this. If you go into the hospital, you're not even thinking about this, but God has already raised up, prepared doctors, nurses, therapists, all the kinds of people who were trained and want to help others, and now they cross paths with you. And God is doing these things in such a separate way until it finally comes together and connects. Third thing is, I think you and I know that we're part of a bigger plan, something bigger than ourselves. And that's when you began to say, it's not just about my lifetime. It's about things that I do that I may never realize it until much later, and maybe never. But what I do matters most, and for generations to come, it'll affect the people that I may never meet nor see nor actually interact with. But God's plan is so much bigger than plan for my life. You and I are so focused on constructing our lives. At some point, we begin to say we're part of a bigger story, that God is using us in a way that we're not always aware of to do something greater than what we could do by ourselves. Fourth is, sometimes the only thing you control is how you respond, meaning loss is devastating. Life is hard. And maybe you can't really respond except by saying, oh God, whatever this moment is, however horrific it is, however deeply painful it is, I want to be faithful. So God, show me the way. Heal my heart. Help me to take something from this that I can use to make this a better world, so that I can help heal the people around me. And so when everything's taken away from you and you feel like a victim and you feel defenseless and you always have a choice to respond. God, help me to be faithful is the only response for those who have lost everything. Fourth is, whenever or wherever you are now is not where you're going to stay. Someday, and it's hard to hear this if you're in the middle of it, someday the pain is going to lessen. Someday you won't feel like you feel at that moment. And over time, with a lot of grace and a lot of prayer, it's going to begin to find its place. It doesn't go away completely. But you're not going to stay there. This story starts with a famine, but it doesn't end with a famine. It starts with death, but it doesn't end with death. It starts with everything that you feel like has been lost. But that's not where it ends. And the place that you start out is never where you're going to end up. And that's part of the hope and faith we have as Christians. Last is, those are the moments that God becomes very real. Not this abstract God, not a Sunday school class lesson. You sit around the table and you read a scripture and you nod your head. It's, my God, I prayed, I dropped to my knees, I had nothing. I thought my world was over. I don't know that I even wanted to live anymore. And that's when God becomes real. And when you talk about grace and you talk about love and you talk about forgiveness and redemption, it becomes incredibly personal and very, very real. Because in our faith, we don't just say God created. We look at Genesis and we say God created it, but he didn't just step back and let everything happen. We say God has created and is creating. There's a creed. We believe in God who has created and is creating, who's come in Jesus, the Word made flesh, to reconcile and make new, who works in us and others by the Spirit, meaning there's not a moment that God's not trying to recreate something. And God, the story of Genesis is that God creates out of chaos this beautiful creation that he sets into motion. So in the chaos of our lives, rest assured, God is trying to create something new. Our task, our challenge, is to sense what that might be and to follow it wherever it leads us. There's a real moment when you just feel like you've lost everything, when there's just nothing. Whatever you loved most is now gone. And how do you sort of find a way in which to move forward? And how do you deal with this devastating loss that just paralyzes you? Anne Lamott, who some of you may have read, one of my favorite authors, talks about a conversation she had with her father, who was talking about the depression and that people were jumping out of windows and skyscrapers in New York because of the stock market crash, because they had lost everything. And even as a kid, she writes, I knew then, I wanted to say to my father, but they didn't really lose everything until they jumped out of a window. There are stories that we tell ourselves, and those stories become the predominant narrative of our life. And there are two primary stories we tell ourselves. One is a contamination story. Go back and look at what happened to Naomi. She feels like she got the short end of the stick. Life is unfair, it's unjust. She's lost a husband, 2 sons. Nobody else has suffered like Naomi. To the degree that she finds herself changing her name to Mara, which is bitter, angry. There's nothing to look forward to. Everything she's ever loved is gone. It's a contamination story that means I'm a victim. I've been shattered. I've been broken, and there's nothing I can do. And somehow it destroys our trust. It shatters our faith. That's what a contamination story does. It also contaminates others around you because it gives a sense that there is no hope. There's another kind of story that we tell ourselves. It's called a redemption story. And it means that even in the hardest moments, we don't dismiss it, we don't ignore it, we feel it deeply. But even in those moments, we feel a presence and a power that we can't even explain, but we all know it's there. And it begins to help heal our hearts, and it begins to move us in a way, and we realize that we have an incredible appreciation for life and for gifts and for the things we used to take for granted, and something begins to happen to us, and our hearts get bigger, and we find ourselves being more compassionate, more kind. Contamination story takes you and makes you smaller, bitter, angry, less trusting. A redemption story opens you up and says, as heartbroken as I have been, now I begin to know the pain of others. Now I can look at other people and say, I do know how you feel, and I want you to know you're not always going to feel this way. And somehow it strengthened our faith. So which one of those that you choose to live with says a whole lot about what's happened to you, but it's more than that. I think it says a whole lot about who's with you, what you believe, and ultimately who you turn to. It's like the cross and the crucifixion. It's like being able to see two stories in two different ways. I had a person who was a good friend of mine, said his father taught him how to swim by picking him up, throwing him into the swimming pool. And he talked about what a seminal moment that was because he learned to do something he didn't think it was possible. He took that as one of the good stories. Another person could do that same story and say, that's when I lost all trust for anybody. I was scared to death. I've never recovered from it. Same story, you see it two different ways. Cross and the crucifixion. You look at it, Jesus, who brought so much hope, so much expectation. People are following him. They think he is the one. And suddenly they're confronted with the reality he's hanging on a cross and he's dying. What does it say? So you look at the story and say, it's the end, it's over. It was all an empty promise. It was all a big lie. We bought it, and it wasn't true. Or you look at him hanging on a cross and you see something else, this incredible love and grace. And this relentless has said that God, I will do anything, go anywhere for you. I would die for you. Same story, you see it in two different ways. Or ask yourself the question, when I look over the course of my life, remember the moments that changed me, which ones do I remember more? Do I remember the losses, the pain, the heartache, or do I remember the blessings, the gains, the growth that I had? So do the stories we carry, do they make us or break us? And stories are everything. I spoke with a mother, have a long relationship. They lost their son who was 10 years old to brain cancer. Can't imagine a more devastating loss. And I don't care. You go to seminary, they'll try to teach you everything. Nobody prepares you. There's nothing you can say other than I'm so sorry and I love you. And I'm going to be with you and we're going to be with you. But there's no easy answers and no religious cliches. There's nothing somebody's going to hand you. It's going to make it better. It's god-awful. It's heartbreaking. And they went through it. And we began to have these conversations over a long period of time. And what began to occur to me is what I know you already know is there's this gradual something that happens is the pain sits at the center of your heart and it paralyzes you. And it feels like you can't even get out of bed. And it is so heavy and so dark you feel it and it's palpable. and it just brings you to your knees, and you don't feel like anything, and you can't feel anything, and you don't want anything. And then after all, the hope is not for the pain to go away, because don't kid yourself, it never goes away. It shouldn't go away. You hurt so much because you love so much. That's the cost of loving, is that it hurts, and eventually all of us will get hurt. That's not the point. Point is not to get rid of the pain. Point is not to kill the pain like David kills Goliath. Point of the hope is to wrestle a blessing of it like Jacob did at Peniel. And we begin to realize that over a gradual period of time, you take the pain, and the best you can do is move it away from the center. It's still going to be there. But then you begin to wake up every day and you realize it's not my first and last thought. It doesn't dominate, paralyze. It still hurts, still there, always will be. But I'm trying to put it in the right place. And then you begin to sort from things that in the response to this most devastating thing, when you feel like you've lost everything, you begin to look and you begin to find a deeper story of people who came to you, who stayed with you, who loved you, who would not let you hide behind closed doors, who brought you back to life, who prayed with you, loved you, continued to ask about you, and made sure. And slowly and surely, you begin to find another story of hope and love. And then you turn to the life of Jesus and you realize that's what it is. Because what we read today is a redemption story. That's what Ruth is. It's a redemption story. And if you haven't figured it out yet, so are you. You're a redemption story. Thanks be to God.